Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a stack of sources, and, well, our mission is to cut through the noise, pull out the key insights, and basically give you a shortcut to understanding some complex topics.
Exactly. We're here to guide you through the material you've provided, focusing on what, really jumps out.
And today, the sources you've shared paint a really fascinating and, frankly, kind of contradictory picture of life and society in Brazil right now.
Definitely. It's a look at both these big systemic pressures and then, how individuals are responding. Legal fights over expression, economic realities on the street. It's all in there.
Absolutely. So first, we're diving into recent shifts in the tax landscape and the criticisms they've attracted, especially around government spending. But then we'll also see these really inspiring examples from the same sources, showing individual action, entrepreneurial spirit pushing back.
Sort of navigating the economic tides, you could say.
Yeah.
Real deep dive into that.
Then we're taking a sharp turn, just like the sources do, into this major legal and cultural debate. It's all about artistic freedom, the limits of humor, sparked by a really controversial case involving comedian Léo Lins.
Yeah, exploring that tension between speech, offense, and, well, the role of the state and all of that.
Okay, let's unpack the stack you've given us. We'll start with the economic picture, the one painted by your sources. There's a definite focus on recent government actions around taxes.
Right.
One source, it doesn't really pull any punches, does it? And says, Taxadad has been active again, bringing in new taxes, hiking existing ones. And it frames it pretty critically, like sticking it to the Brazilian people.
Yeah, that framing really sets a strong tone for the critique that runs through the material you gave us. And the sources, they detail some specific changes that, well, seem designed to bring in more money, hitting certain investments and businesses.
Right. So the sources point to specific investment taxes. There's a new 5% income tax, but only on new money going into things like LCI, that's real estate credit notes, LCA, agribusiness credit notes, CRI, real estate receivables certificates, CRA, agribusiness receivables certificates, and also these incentivized debentures, the ones usually for infrastructure.
And the key detail there, highlighted in the sources, is that these were, previously exempt from income tax, totally exempt.
Ah, okay.
So any money you already had in them stays tax-free, but any new cash going in now faces that 5% hit. And the sources explain LCI, LCA are basically ways you lend money to real estate or agribusiness.
Got it. So investment options that were attractive partly because they were tax-free. Well, they're less attractive now for new capital. What about businesses? Did the sources mention them?
Oh, yeah. The material covers increases for businesses, too. It looks like the CSLL, that's the social contribution on net profit for fintechs, is taking a pretty big jump.
How big?
From 9% up to maybe 15 or even 20%. The sources suggest this basically puts their tax burden more in line with the bigger banks.
Wow, that's a significant shift for fintechs.
It really is.
Yeah.
And there's also an increase mentioned for online betting companies, the bets, as they're often called. The tax on their gross revenue is apparently going up from 12% to 18%.
So it's hitting different areas than individual investments, specific business types like fintechs and betting. What's the core criticism running through the sources about why this is happening? Why raise these taxes now?
Well, the central critique presented in the material is that these measures, they hit the average investor and certain businesses harder, while, according to these sources, the spending and, let's say, privileges at the top, they stay untouched.
Right, and this critique of spending seems to be a really key thread alongside the tax hikes. The argument the sources are making is taxes go up, but there's no cutback in what they call benefits for the, already well-off.
Exactly. The sources list specific examples they point to, like $4,000 housing aid for officials who already own property, official cars, private jets, daily allowances, all sorts of perks, and high salaries. The argument presented is that these kinds of spending, framed as privileges, they weren't touched when the government decided it needed more revenue and looked elsewhere, like these investments in businesses.
It's very sharp contrast the sources are drawing there. And the criticism seems to go deeper than just how much tax, right? It's about where the money actually goes in the end.
Yes, precisely. The sources contrast Brazil with countries often known for high taxes.
Like where?
They mention places like Sweden, Norway, Germany, Canada, the U.S. The sources sort of acknowledge, okay, taxes are high there too, but the difference they highlight is that there, the tax money often comes back as, real public services.
Things you can see and use.
Yeah, quality health care, real public safety, decent transportation systems, things that benefit the general population.
Whereas in Brazil, according to the picture these sources paint, that same tax revenue is described as turning into, what was it, privilege, perks, appointed positions, corruption, and waste.
That's the language used, yes. So the problem in this view presented isn't necessarily high taxes themselves, but the perception of, well, mismanagement and where the money ends up.
This picture laid out by the sources, it definitely raises some big questions for you, the listener. I mean, what does this environment mean for someone trying to save or invest in Brazil? How might this perspective make someone feel like the system is kind of stacked against them?
It certainly paints a challenging backdrop. But then, interestingly, the sources shift perspective quite a bit. After going through all these systemic issues, they look at how individuals are actually responding, their mindset.
Right. There's that critique first of the envious Brazilian.
Yes, one source brings that up. It's depicted as someone who maybe spends everything they earn, maybe even on things they can't really afford, and then resents people who are more disciplined with money, who save or invest. It's presented as a critical look at a certain mindset.
But then, in stark contrast to that critique, the sources give these really powerful examples of individual entrepreneurial spirit, people thriving despite everything we just talked about. First, there's that young street vendor selling candy.
Oh yeah, that's a really striking example from the material. This young guy, he calls himself a freelancer, a PJ. He travels strategically for opportunities like going to Balneario Camboriú when there's a holiday crowd. And he works well, relentlessly.
Every single day, you said.
Every day, according to the source. Only takes off from midnight to 7 a.m. And his whole approach to money is fascinating. He sees buying his candy stock, $91, cost not as an expense, but as active spending.
Active spending? Why?
Because, as the source reports, that 91 investment brought him over $700 in profit that day. He clearly gets the idea of investing capital to make more capital.
That's incredible. And his discipline. And the sources mentioned his potential daily profit, right? Up to $750 in a place like Balneario, maybe, or $300 or $500 usually in Santos. And his rule.
If I don't sell everything, I don't go home. That's what the source quotes him saying. It's a powerful display of work ethic, strategic thinking, financial literacy, all happening right there on the street.
And there was another example too, wasn't there? Even younger. The kid selling pasocas, the peanut candy.
Yeah, that one also stands out in the sources. It illustrates a simple but really effective business model. He sells the pasocas for $2 each. A box of 50 costs him $20. Sell the box, you make $100 revenue.
Which means $80 profit.
Exactly. And the sources highlight that he understands he needs to reinvest that profit right away to buy more stock. He even talks about paying the price, which for him means selling in the rain.
Wow.
So these examples, pulled straight from your sources, they offer this really compelling contrast to the earlier discussion about the big economic challenges. They show this mindset of, hard work, discipline, smart financial moves, resilience, happening regardless of the tax policies or government spending critiques.
So it's like the sources present these two realities side by side. Systemic issues making things tough for savers and businesses, but also individuals finding ways to hustle and build something within that very system. A powerful juxtaposition in the material. Okay, now let's shift gears completely. Like you said, the sources guide us to a totally different, but just as significant topic. This major legal case involving comedian Léo Lins. It's really stirred up a huge debate about freedom of expression in Brazil.
Absolutely. This case, as it's detailed in your sources, really forces a confrontation between artistic freedom and the legal limits society puts on speech, especially when it comes to offensive stuff.
And the basic facts reported are pretty stark. Léo Lins sentenced to 8 years, 3 months, and 9 days in prison. That specific number, it's jarring.
It is. And on top of that, significant financial penalties. Fines over $1.7 million, plus damages around $303,000.
And all this stems from jokes made in his stand-up show, right? Perturbador, it was called.
That's right. The sources specify the jokes were found offensive to various minority groups, and crucially, the sentence was increased because of offenses against people with disabilities.
What's the legal basis here, according to the material?
Well, the conviction is based on relatively recent laws from 2015 and 2022 aimed at fighting racism and ableism, or capacitismo. The sources mention the judge, Barbara de Lima Isipi, from the 3rd Federal Criminal Court of São Paulo. She apparently applied the literality of the law against speech that offends or humiliates these protected groups.
And there's a point highlighted in the sources about who brought the case forward.
Yes, that's emphasized by critics of the ruling. The case was initiated by the public ministry itself, not by, say, individuals from the offended groups who were actually at the show and felt harmed.
Okay, so this case, naturally it throws that fundamental debate about free speech versus its limits right into the spotlight. And your sources, they lay out arguments from both sides.
They do. On one side, you have the argument supporting Lins and artistic freedom. These come from Lins himself, his lawyer, Carlos Eduardo Reyes Ramos, legal experts like Andre Marsiglia, fellow comedians like Helio de la Peña and Fabio Rabin, and observers like the streamer Ricardo Diaz.
And their perspective, as the sources present it, is basically that humor on stage is art. It's fiction. It often involves a character, a persona, separate from the actual comedian, performed in a specific context, the environment of the comedy club.
Right. Lins himself is quoted saying the environment dictates the limits, not the humor itself. And sources from this side ask, is freedom really freedom if it has all these limits imposed?
His lawyer apparently called the sentence disproportionate.
Extremely disproportionate, according to the source, comparing it even to penalties for really serious crimes like drug trafficking, homicide, or corruption.
And there's a big concern raised in these sources about precedent, right?
Huge concern. That this decision sets a dangerous precedent leading to censorship, maybe even self-censorship, where artists get scared to tackle difficult subjects. The idea of the state stepping in to judge what's funny, well, it's framed as authoritarian.
The argument being the audience chooses to be there. If they're offended, they can leave or maybe sue individually, but the state shouldn't be criminalizing the art itself.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And one source even mentions Lins criticizing the judge for supposedly using Wikipedia as a theoretical basis for the conviction. Other comedians quoted in the sources make comparisons, like, would you ban a soap opera for dealing with tough issues? They argue a comedian's job is to make people laugh, not necessarily be a role model, and art doesn't always have to be, pretty.
And that streamer, Ricardo Diaz.
He highlighted, according to the source, that the public ministry brought the case, and he noted, sort of tellingly, the apparent lack of comedians making jokes about the judge afterwards, suggesting maybe that chilling effect, that self-censorship is already happening.
Okay, so that's one side. What about the arguments for legal limits on expression?
Well, on that side, we hear perspectives like Professor Tiago Boutinos and, implicitly, the reasoning behind the prosecution and the judge's decision, as it's described in the sources.
And their view is?
Their view, presented in the sources, is that freedom of expression isn't absolute. It serves a purpose, mainly protecting democracy. So if speech actually harms democracy by diminishing, humiliating, or inciting prejudice against protected groups, it crosses a line. It falls outside what should be protected expression.
And these sources suggest it's possible to be funny without crossing that line.
Right. They imply that humor can exist within legal boundaries, without resorting to discriminatory or deeply offensive content, as defined by the law.
And where does the case stand now? He's not actually in prison yet.
No. The sources note this was a first-instance decision. Lins' defense is appealing, so he remains free while that process goes on.
So, this whole case, as laid out in your sources, it really forces us to think about that fundamental question, one that pops up globally. Where exactly is the line for humor and offensive speech? And maybe more importantly, who gets to draw it? What authority? What happens when the state intervenes with this kind of force and artistic expression?
It really throws into sharp relief that ongoing tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between protecting the rights and dignity of groups who might be vulnerable and preserving that space for free expression.
Yeah.
Even when it makes people uncomfortable or pushes boundaries.
So we've taken quite a deep dive into the sources you provided today. We've looked at these two really different but maybe related aspects of Brazil right now: the economic situation, taxes, spending critiques.
And contrasted that with individual resilience.
Exactly. And then this intense cultural and legal fight over free speech, sparked by the Léo Lins case.
And these sources, they don't just give facts, do they? They really highlight these conflicting forces. Top-down government action versus bottom-up individual grit, the power of the legal system versus artists pushing back.
And maybe, as the sources suggest, beneath both these big issues, the economy and free speech, there's this common thread. Questions about rules, about power, about who gets to decide how the whole system works.
Yeah, whether it's rules about who gets the money and how wealth is distributed, or rules about what you're allowed to say and who enforces those boundaries.
So here's maybe something to chew on from the material as you continue your own deep dive. Does Seeing that individual resilience, the street vendors making it work, does that change how you view the significance of those systemic economic critiques presented in the sources?
And maybe flip that around. Does seeing the state intervene so forcefully in artistic expression, like in the Lins case, does that maybe shed light on the power dynamics at play in the economic sphere too? Just something to think about.
Well, thank you for sharing these sources with us and letting us dive deep like this. Keep digging, keep questioning.